Hi, everyone. Welcome.
Welcome, welcome, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's so great to be here with all of you. We might have some more people coming through in the next couple of minutes or so, but I will go ahead and get started. My name is Dilruba Ahmed, and I'm super excited to be here with all of you and to see both new faces and some familiar faces here in the Zoom room. I am really excited to talk about a poem from Jericho Brown's book, The Tradition, this year's choice for One Book, One Philadelphia. And I'd like to first start by saying thank you to Emma Eisenberg and Jean Murphy, both of Blue Stoop, for inviting me to do this session. And Jean is here helping out with all things techie. And Jean will be posting the PDF for today's session in the chat a few times in the first few minutes so that you can feel free to download it, refer to that could be your copy for your reference, but I'll be showing all the relevant text on my screen so you can see it while we're talking. I'd also just like to make a shout out to Brittany Sterner of One Book, One Philadelphia, if she's here. I'm just scanning names. Brittany, hi. Did you want to say anything? We certainly have space for you if you'd like to say a few words.
No, not really. Just thank you for doing this. And yeah, just to share with everyone that this is a beautiful partnership that's part of 8 weeks of programming around the tradition. And I can drop a link to the calendar in the chat. So we have panels, creative workshops, book discussions, free copies of the tradition. Yeah, but thank you, Ruba, so much. I'm really looking forward to this.
Thank you. Thanks for being here, and thanks for hosting and organizing so many amazing events around this book. So what I'd love to do is start with some brief introductions. I know we're all calling in from different places, and it's always just nice to kind of know who's in the room, where you are located geographically, however you'd like to interpret that, and what drew you to this session. So if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat your first name, where you're calling in from, and that could be city, county, region, time zone, and what drew you to the session. And I'll just briefly say I am calling in from Delaware County outside of Philadelphia, and I've been a fan of Jericho Brown's work for a long time, and we were actually in a workshop together years and years ago. So if you hear me referring to him as Jericho instead of Brown, sort of more formally the way I would with a poet that I don't know, that's why. So I'm just going to take a peek here at the chat. And those of you just joining, you'll see that Jean is putting a PDF in the chat for you that's for today, and I'll also be sharing it on the screen. Okay, so one of my neighbors is here, someone who's from my town. Hi, Amy, that's great to see you. We've got Brittany's calling in from Philly, Liz also from Philly, and has already led a discussion on the book, so we'll be leaning on you for interpretations and comments. Jean from West Philly. We've got Kyle from Germantown. Oh, these are going so fast. Oh, Shahrazad's here. Hi, Shahrazad. Wonderful to have you all here in the room. Our agenda for today is pretty straightforward. Oh, Levon is a neighbor too. Hi, Levon. Great to see you. So our agenda for today is pretty straightforward. We're going to start by looking at one of the poems from the tradition. It's the title poem, The Tradition. And we'll take some time to unpack it. And I'll be looking for general responses, but we'll also get a little nitty gritty with looking at craft and talking about what are the moves that Brown makes in the poem, and what are the effects of those moves? What's the impact on us as readers? And then we'll reserve a little time at the end of this hour to do some writing of our own, inspired by and related to the poem at hand. So I love to hear poets read their work. And so I'm excited to share with you a video that I found of Jericho Brown reading the poem. Just pull that up. Okay, I'll share my screen and hopefully this comes through. sorry about that. Looks like when I put it in full screen, it doesn't like that. So let me try again. Here we go.
The tradition. Aster, nasturtium, delphinium. We thought fingers in dirt meant it was our dirt, learning names in heat, in elements classical philosophers said could change us. Stargazer, foxglove. Summer seemed to bloom against the will of the sun, which news reports claimed flamed hotter on this planet than when our dead fathers wiped sweat from their necks. Cosmos, baby's breath. Men like me and my brothers filmed what we planted for proof we existed before too late. Sped the video to see blossoms brought in seconds. Colors you expect in poems where the world ends. Everything cut down. John Crawford, Eric Garner, Mike Brown.
I'm going to share on my screen the PDF that I'll be sort of walking you through today. And as I mentioned, Jean is also putting this in the chat. So you can, if you prefer to download it from there and look at it directly, you can feel free to do that. But I'd like to just start our conversation by acknowledging that Jericho Brown's book is both beautiful and brutal. And so, this poem is, I think, it just sort of crystallizes that in one poem. So, many of the things we're going to talk about today will be difficult and in some cases uncomfortable. So just, sort of putting that out there. So on the screen here and in the chat too, if you'd like to have your own copy, is the text of the poem. And then on the second page, I have a bunch of guiding questions. And I've also included this little bit of context that I think helps to frame discussions around work like this. And that's a quote from Claudia Rankine. And this is from her speech at AWP that was adapted into an essay that's now posted on the website for AWP called In Our Way, Racism and Creative Writing. One of the things that Rankine says that I find really compelling and instructive is this. She says, writing is and should be an arena full of discomfort as we try to keep present the differences that keep us in relation. So that's sort of something I try to keep on the forefront of my mind when I'm writing, and also something that I think about when I'm reading many things, including this book. So instead of sort of plunging directly into the guiding questions, I have a lot of different questions for all of you, a lot of different craft angles we can take, but I'm interested in sort of getting, general responses, what it was like for you to read this poem, what stands out, what are the moments where things are happening where you feel like there's heat or tension or you have questions, and we can start there in terms of unpacking the poem. So are there any brave volunteers who'd like to, you can give me a wave or just unmute yourself and jump in and we can, sort of figure it out if we end up bumping into each other. What are your responses as readers and as human beings when you read this poem?
I'll go. The choice of flowers listed is so intentional and moving, especially when you get to the last line and then you go back and read again.
Yeah. Talk to us about the flowers.
Well, of course, stargazer, the dream, cosmos and baby's breath, and what happens to our breath. So, and I'm sure I could go flower by flower and have some deep associations with each one, but those stuck out for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have stargazer and cosmos sort of, creating this larger context of the universe and of existence. And then baby's breath, which is a very delicate and small flower, right? And just the name of it, right? Thinking about babies, thinking about people's children, the people who've been, the Black people who've been killed, and the children of those people. And then of course, thinking about breath and you know, especially that's something I think, you know, even post the writing of this poem has been very much on in discussion and on everyone's mind in terms of the violence against Black people and Black men specifically. Liz, am I saying your name right? Is it
Yeah,
Liz?
yeah, that's right. I love this poem. And also because the flowers are perennials, you cut them and they come back, but also because it's a sonnet. And I found in this book, there's like all these traditions. And one of the tradition is this Western poetic tradition of the sonnet with the couplet at the end. And there's this pastoral tradition, except, you know, with those traditions that he's inherited as a contemporary poet, he's also changing what they mean, you know, because of how he uses it to talk about the tradition of violence against Black men as well. So I think this poem is intense, and it's just full of connections and movement almost through time, to where you have to video the flowers of this generation really fast because the men are going to be cut down, and that beautiful matching number of syllables between the first 3 flowers and the last 3 names. I just think this poem has so much in it. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, it's so rich and it's so intense, and I feel like we could come at it from so many different angles. I hope we get to cover a lot of it in the next hours, but I do feel like we could talk for hours about this one piece. But you're absolutely right. You know, thinking about the idea of tradition, one aspect of tradition is the sonnet tradition, right? So here we have a sonnet with a long tradition of a certain formal structure, but also historically around themes of love, right? So, you know, if we think about how Brown is inhabiting the sonnet structure, how he's, you know, sort of adhering to a given form, and in what ways he's subverting it or experimenting with it or sort of pushing against it. You know, there are many things that stand out. But we can see this as being placed, you know, very firmly in a tradition of love poetry, that love being, you know, love for humanity, right? Humanity that, as Liz pointed out, is being cut down. So there's the tradition of the sonnet. There's this, one of the interviews that I read with Jericho Brown, with the interviewer sort of frames it as this tradition of, you know, planting gardens, continuing to plant gardens. But the other, you know, sort of more difficult tradition to contend with is this, you know, the legacy of racial violence in America. And, you know, for Jericho Brown to frame that as a tradition is deeply bitter. But then the poem opens with these beautiful words, right? These beautiful multisyllable words that are very soft, and sort of, you know, the first one requires you to kind of open your mouth. So there's a lot of different sources of tension like that here in the poem. Other thoughts about either the formal structure, the sonnet inhabiting, and, you know, how the idea of tradition comes across, whether that's through the sonnet, through the content, or anything else. Brittany, go ahead.
Sure. I was just going to add, I really appreciate everything that's been shared, and I was going to add something that I really appreciate about this poem is the kind of inclusion of comments on climate change and the line, "Summer seemed to bloom against the will of the sun." So this kind of intensity and resistance, but that's also kind of weaving different forms of violence together, which is something that I think he does a lot throughout the book. You know, weaving forms of violence that are symptoms of white supremacy and racial capitalism.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much woven into this poem. It's remarkable. And so many of the poems in the book grapple with the pastoral tradition. So, you know, we can think of the pastoral tradition as longstanding tradition of writing that is in some way about humans and their relationship with the land. So, there was a phase during which writers were sort of, idealizing the landscape and human relationship with the land. There were phases in history where, the people writing those poems were actually not in the countryside. They were in the courts and sort of, romanticizing it. Other times it was used to actually criticize courtly life, and sort of put rural bucolic existence as a contrast to it. One of my favorite ways of framing the pastoral poem as a tradition or as a form comes from a book edited by Evan Boland and Mark Strand called The Making of a Poem. And the way that they talked about the pastoral in that book is to say that for contemporary poets, the pastoral form still retains a mixture of sweet dream and rude awakening, the same mixture it's always offered. And so, we can also think about the tradition of the pastoral poem with this piece by Jericho Brown, in terms of thinking about, within the metaphor, which, the metaphor kind of grows and blossoms as well. The first time we encounter fingers in dirt, as a reader, I take that as literal planting, but that literal action of planting and digging in the dirt grows into something else and takes on this, enormous metaphorical power. So, if we think about the poem in those terms, sweet dream and rude awakening, part of what Brown folds in is climate crisis, which amazes me that a poem this short and this tight has so much happening in it with respect to violence against Black people, and the dreams, the dreams that were cut short. And yet, in the midst of that, he makes a gesture towards the intensification of climate crisis, which also, sort of all part of a bigger picture and all contributing to the intensification of tone in the poem. So that's certainly an aspect of, if we're thinking about sweet dream and rude awakening, that's certainly another aspect of rude awakening. And I'm just curious to hear from others, are there other elements here that you would either kind of put into the framework of sweet dream or kind of think of as, there's so much rude awakening. So, what's that interplay? Someone is using, it's Judith, the icon.
Yes, hi, thank you. This is also fascinating, and it's going so quickly that I'm having a hard time keeping up. So there was a point you were making where you were saying for contemporary, I don't know if you'll remember what you were saying, but you're saying for contemporary poets, the pastoral poem, something, and it was fascinating. And I, by the time I was reading it, I didn't know what it was.
It's in the handout. If you look a little further down, I've put it in there. It's from a book called The Making of a Poem. And the idea is that Evan Boland and Mark Strand frame the contemporary pastoral poem as having an interplay of sweet dream and rude awakening. Does that help to answer your
dream and an awakening?
And rude awakening.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Any other thoughts, either about that aspect of sweet dream or the interplay of it with rude awakening here?
Well, the dirt is a rude awakening.
Yeah, talk to us about that.
Fingers in dirt meant it was our dirt. And, that to me feels like an allusion to slavery, and also the other ways that white supremacy, it's limited property ownership for Black people.
Yeah, definitely. There's a sort of, indirect gesture towards the idea of ownership. The speaker is implicitly asking, is it not our dirt? Do we not have ownership over any of this? Whether it's land, our existence, our rights. We thought fingers in dirt meant it was our dirt, right? So, which implies, no, it's not. That's not the case. So, the poem starts with this beautiful language, this, evoking flowers. And if you know what they are, they're all pretty in their own way, but then moves into this this, disillusionment or disappointment about what reality really is. And it's all really specifically grounded in a physical context. So that at this point, we're thinking literally about hands and dirt. But then what we see is that Brown is fleshing out this metaphor in a way that helps us understand what it is that I think it was Liz said earlier in terms of this metaphor of planting, right? Planting seeds, planting flowers, and not even having a chance to see them come to fruition, but instead having to sort of, psychologically fast forward to imagine what it might be like to bring a life to fruition, to bring a life to its peaceful conclusion. But knowing in the background the rude awakening of, having that intensity and that urgency comes from the too late, right? Proof we existed before it's too late. What else? What else stands out to people? Either moments of sweet dream, rude awakening, or anything else. Scheherazade, go ahead.
I really, the turn when moving from the sweats of dead fathers, and then to on their next moving to Cosmos and Baby Breath, then to now. That's brilliant. I mean, that be, without any, it's done so subtle that, going from the generation back to Men Like Me and My Brothers filmed. I thought for me, that's a major part of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm still stunned by just how much is happening in such a short and intense poem. But here we have the lines: summer seemed to bloom against the will of the sun, right? So there's this feeling of persisting, right? Or resisting, of blooming and, experiencing life under these difficult and intense circumstances. That gesture towards, climate crisis, the intensification sort of everything, right? Everything is being ratcheted up here. And then recalling our dead fathers, right? So going back in time, and thinking about, the toil, the physical labor of a generations past. And then, just veering for a moment back into those beautiful sounds, right? Conjuring the flowers, just a little gesture towards sweet dream. He's really weaving back and forth here in a really powerful way to create an interplay between those two forces at work. Lavon.
I think the use of the flower foxglove is pretty interesting as well, because foxglove is beautiful, but it can be deadly as well. So there's that double meaning coming out there.
That's amazing. So I didn't know that. And that adds another layer of meaning, right? Something that's visually very beautiful, but dangerous, right? There's threat and risk there. That adds another layer of meaning and intensity and complicates the tone too, right? So that not all of these flowers are necessarily strictly beautiful, right? Not just the sweetness or the dream, but complicated in some way.
And it's digitalis. It's used as a heart medicine.
Oh, wow. I didn't know this. Wow, this is amazing. Flower. Amazing. Judith, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I did. It was your friend there was talking about the cosmos and baby breath, and that's what I wanted to mention also, because when he was first reading it, I always forget the name of cosmos, and I love it. It was one of the first flowers I ever had when I had an actual garden, and the baby's breath together, and they're both so delicate. Like they have very long stems that are so fragile. And we come off of this, him saying, on this flamed hotter on this planet than when our dead fathers wiped sweat from their necks. And then he says cosmos and baby breath. And I was picturing these long, delicate necks that are so snippable and breakable.
Yeah.
Because when you think of a man's neck like that, especially if he's been, working in the field or the garden, it's a thick, sturdy neck, but he goes right into the fragility.
Yeah, absolutely. There's an amazing move there in terms of moving from the intensification of the sun and the entire context, the dead fathers, right, gesturing towards the past and history, and the, thinking of the labor and the toil, both physical, literal, and figurative, right? And then turning to these soft words that conjure up beautiful, delicate, vulnerable flowers, putting all those things up against each other, that kind of juxtaposition creates an enormous amount of tension and really adds a lot of texture and tension to the poem. Kyle, did you want to talk a little bit about the ending of the poem? I see your comment here in the chat.
Oh, yeah. I like how just thinking about like what is there a rude awakening here? I feel like that last line, we leave all the imagery behind and it's just name, 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 which feels very aligned with the Black Lives Matter, say their names. We're leaving the poetry literature world and now we're back in you, the reader's world. And this really happened, this is real, I think is really powerful. And that last one, because I feel like normally you hear Michael Brown, and so that Mike Brown really punctuates the whole thing.
Yeah, it's a very powerful ending, and you're right, there's a shift here from, we're in the world of the metaphor. He's fleshed it out so deftly so that we understand exactly, we understand both sort of exactly and synaptically and intuitively, and yet it also does this amazing thing where when we think about metaphor, Stephen Dobbins writes about metaphor in Best Words, Best Order. And what he says is that, the writers have to flesh out the contexts, right? Physical, emotional, and intellectual, so that we understand as readers what the metaphor is trying to convey. But at the same time, he says that some of the most successful metaphors also are sort of unattainable, they can't be grasped, they can't be fully encompassed. And I feel like that's, what Dobbins says is that sort of invites the reader to go back and to keep asking the question, how are these two unlike things the same? What can I draw from that relationship? How does one shed light on the other? And so I think this poem is really powerful in that sense, that we keep going back to the metaphor and saying, like, how is the life of a Black man delicate and fleeting, as delicate and as fleeting as these flowers that were planted in the earth with great hopes for reaching the end, but being cut down before that. And so this shift at the end, moving from the metaphor into reality, right, with just the names of 3 of the men who've been killed, among so many, and written in a way that precisely echoes the first 3 words of the poem, right? So the first 3 words invite us in with this beautiful language, conjuring flowers, something lovely and delicate, and ending with the 3 names in the same kind of pattern, italicized, a sequence of 3, really lends a lot of, it's so poignant in terms of the impact that it has on us as readers in terms of thinking about these lives cut short. John Crawford was in his early 20s. Mike Brown was just a kid. Eric Garner was, I think, early 40s. This is young. This is very young, and so that vulnerability, the fleeting nature of their lives, all of that just comes, crystallizes in an amazing and both beautiful and brutal way. Those are the 2 words that I just keep coming back to. What else stands out to you in this poem, or what are some questions you have? Scheherazade, go ahead.
I think it's actually, he sort of hints at the beginning when it starts saying, learning names in heat, in elements, classical philosophers said could change us. I think that's the naming the same way that the naming flowers, naming at the end, that's the heart of it, I thought.
Right, this kind of transformation from referring to flowers, then referring to humans, right? And that idea of elements that could change us, right? So the classical elements were, and I might not get them all, but like fire, earth, air, wind, what am I forgetting? Water. So, the idea was that these were sort of the driving forces in the world. So you're right, he's already hinting at the idea of change, of one thing sort of, metamorphosing into another, there's a lot of that kind of shifting or an implication of shifting happening in the poem. Levon.
I think the title in itself is very chilling in its own way, because the tradition, and then to come to the end and have the names of those Black men, it's almost like he's trying to say that killing Black or people of color has become a tradition in America. Frightening.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the title is so complex, right? Once we understand the poem, because there is a really bitter take on the idea of tradition here, which is exactly that, right? This repeated persecution of Black people and killing of Black men, and we as readers know those are just 3 of the names, but that this list could be so much longer. That it is longer, and on the page it could be so much longer. So that move in the poem brings, so we have the sort of sweet dream aspect of hope and dreams for someone's life, the kind of disillusionment and disappointment of what reality consists of, and then this other layer that's done so subtly of deep bitterness, right? Here we are, like here's an American tradition. It's very cutting, but also so subtle, so subtle. What else? Liz, did you want to say a little bit more about tradition?
I just, the book opens up with the story of Ganymede, and of course I looked it up, and when I realized it was like, this story of the gods, but it was really a story of rape and then paying off the father for the rape of the son and the stealing of the son. It made me realize that there is just so much of the Western tradition, I mean, from the Greeks on, that we've inherited, that we don't think about how violent and dangerous these ideas are. We raise our children on the Greek myths without realizing, like, the gods are awful. I mean, awful. They come down and rape people. And that because they're supreme beings, somehow this is the right order of the world. And I think that, we get ideas of white supremacy from this tradition, and this idea of a hierarchy of humanity that is just so dangerous. And so what I loved about the whole poetry collection was that it threaded with this idea of these very dangerous traditions, and really made me start think about, yes, our American myths that came from the European myths, that came from the Greek myths, that this tradition that we need to really dismantle, because implicit in it is this dangerous racist idea of supremacy.
Yeah, absolutely. It was interesting to hear Jericho talk in one of the interviews about the work, and the way he framed it was that what his ambition was to grapple with evil and the normalization of evil, and you can really see that at work in the poems. Judith, I wasn't sure whether you had your hand up again or whether it was still up from last time. Oh, we can't hear you. You'll just need to unmute yourself.
Did that work?
Yes, I hear you now.
No, I actually don't know how to take my hand down, so that's the problem.
Okay. No, yeah, it looks like the icon's gone now. So you're
How do I take the hand down? I don't.
It's actually down now. So
okay.
Yeah, no more hand icon.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, we've covered a lot of ground, right? We've talked about tradition in terms of, this very bitter framing, rightly so, the tradition of American persecution of Black people. We've talked about the tradition of the sonnet and how Brown is sort of inhabiting, but also subverting that. The tradition of the pastoral, this notion of the sweet dream and the rude awakening, the relationship between humans and the land, which here is, happening within the context of the poem. I do think there's, it seems to me that this poem is in conversation with Ross Gay's poem, A Needful Fact, because both of these, I think, part of what we come to learn about Eric Garner is that he worked in Parks and Rec. And so, he was a horticulturist. So I feel like that's kind of, that's part of the context that's at work here. We've talked about the tradition of, let's see, so the tradition of, formally and in terms of context as well. So the sonnet as a kind of love poem, right? And how Brown is sort of handling that and using that, inhabiting the tradition here, but also expanding it. We've talked about some of the gestures he makes here in terms of speech and awakening, referring to climate crisis, but most of all, this all-encompassing metaphor, this governing metaphor that so powerfully conveys this larger context, where sort of, among the cosmos, here's this small existence that we each have, right? Trying to plant things in the dirt, trying to carve out a life. And yet for Black people, and specifically for Black men, this is a fleeting and urgent effort, right? Because they don't know how far into their lives they're going to make it. So that fleeting nature, the urgency around it, the delicacy of life, and the vulnerability of Black people, and specifically Black men, it's all here in the metaphor, very powerfully conveyed. So I feel like we've covered a lot of ground, but what are some of the questions you have? What are some of the other comments you have or questions you have about the piece? Okay, well, if you think of any other ones, you can, jump in or use the hand icon. This is probably good timing to shift gears a bit, and let me just move this so I can scroll down a little bit more easily. Okay, so here in the handout, if you want to come back to the, to the poem afterwards, all kinds of questions here. Like I said, I think we've covered all of it and more. So let's shift gears a little bit and think about our own writing. I think there's so many things we can learn from this poem. It's really, just so rich. But I've tried to take two slices. So one slice is thinking about metaphor, and the other slice is thinking about that tradition of the pastoral sweet dream and rude awakening. So I am offering two options for writing prompts. The first one is to, can everybody see this on the screen? Okay. Yeah. So option A is to write a poem of loss that uses metaphor, and that loss can be large or small. It can be personal or public. And the idea is to try to really flesh out the physical, emotional, and intellectual contexts. In other words, what do you want the reader to know, to feel, and to think? And if you need, a little Kickstarter, you can click on this link and you'll see that there's a metaphor generator online that isn't always great. It doesn't always produce fantastic metaphors, but it can give you a place to start. Let me see if I can get this to share on the screen. Basically, you enter a number, meaning the number of metaphors you'd like. Can everybody see this on the screen? Okay, so if I don't like these, I can put in another number and randomize, and this might just give us a starting point. So in what ways is generosity like a window? In what ways is tolerance like a bird cage? So that might not be getting at the exact experience of loss that you're grappling with, but it might give you a starting place for thinking about how is X like Y? How can I draw that out in ways that are going to be meaningful and expressive? So that link is in the PDF. All right, going back to the PDF, the other prompt is to write a poem with an interplay of sweet dream and rude awakening. So you can grapple directly with the idea of race and racial justice, or with the relationship between humans and the environment, or other topics. You can kind of go more broadly to think about what's the kind of interplay between sort of dark and light. So why don't we take about 15 minutes or so to do some writing, and you can choose either prompt. I'm gonna set a timer and I'll put my mic on mute, and then we'll come back at the end for just a few minutes to kind of reflect and close. Is everybody clear on what to do? Ready to go? Okay. that's just about time. So go ahead and wrap up whatever thought you're on. I wanted to note just briefly that we've talked a fair amount about the sonic qualities of the diction related to the flowers and just how beautiful and soft many of those words are. But what we haven't talked about is sonic qualities just sort of broadly throughout the poem. So, you know, I encourage you to spend time with the poem later when you have a chance with that lens in mind. I'll just give one example of the short E sounds. So we have the words dead, sweat, neck, breath, and then a little later in the poem, expect, ends, everything. So there's this wonderful musicality to his work, and it builds a kind of sonic cohesion throughout. So I just wanted to point that out, because that's something that I really admire in Jericho's work, and you know, we could probably spend another hour just talking about that. But I thought I would just close with a chance for a couple of people reflections from a couple of you to hear, you know, what was this process like, or any other, you know, closing thoughts you might have.
Do you want us to read what we wrote?
I usually don't ask people to read what they wrote, just because I don't like reading my work cold like that. But if you are feeling brave, by all means, I welcome you to share.
Sure, I'll throw it out. Okay.
Sure.
The sky is deep cliche blue. Heard there's an ocean this color, but from Jersey, settle for murky brown green. It's Easter. Before we eat all day at her mother's and take dozens of photos of various combinations, no, you stand here. Stop making goofy faces. Put your middle finger away. We visit her grandparents and her father in Greenwood Cemetery and plant tulips that she'll return for in a few weeks.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. Any closing thoughts from others, or discoveries or reflections on the process of trying to, you know, take a slice of the craft moves we see in Jericho Brown's work? Mabel, you look like you're about to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to share a quick comment, just kind of also relating to Jericho Brown's poem. It made me just think about the power and the empowerment that exists in names and naming, and just also in like the name as like a proof of existence of something or someone having existed in the world. And I wrote a short poem about a cousin that we had lost a long time ago. And I titled the poem his name, and it just occurred to me that it's been like so long that I had like almost forgotten his English name. And so I kind of like made that connection and just, I don't know, just felt that, you know, that kind of empowerment and just remembering someone's name.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the other aspect we haven't really talked about in these terms is this is an elegy. You know, this poem is doing so many things. It's a sonnet, it's a pastoral poem, and it's also an elegy. And there's power in naming the dead. You know, and, it's an important aspect of remembering them and not sort of letting history brush things under the rug. So thank you for sharing that. Looks like we're just about at time. I do wish we could keep going and keep talking about this poem. I think it's so rich, and I hope that you did too. And I encourage you to, you know, spend time with the hand up. There's a lot of stuff in there, and you can certainly come back to these drafts and flesh them out or try the other option. It was really a delight to meet with all of you here in the Zoom room, ranging from, you know, my neighborhood all the way to Canada. So thanks for joining, and stay safe and keep writing.
Thank you so much. That was so lovely. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.